Chapter 13 of Bunner Sisters. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Spring had really come at last. There were leaves on the ailanthus tree that Evelina could see from her bed, gentle clouds floated over it in the blue, and now and then the cry of a flower seller sounded from the street. One day there was a shy knock on the back room door, and Johnny Hawkins came in with 2 yellow jonquils in his fist. He was getting bigger and squarer, and his round freckled face was growing into a smaller copy of his father's. He walked up to Evelina and held out the flowers. "They blew off the cart, and the feller said I could keep 'em, but you can have 'em," he announced. Eliza rose from her seat at the sewing machine and tried to take the flowers from him. "They ain't for you, they're for her," he sturdily objected, and Evelina held out her hand for the jonquils. After Johnny had gone, she lay and looked at them without speaking. Eliza, who had gone back to the machine, bent her head over the seam she was stitching. The click, click, click of the machine sounded in her ear like the tick of Ramy's clock, and it seemed to her that life had gone backward, and that Evelina, radiant and foolish, had just come into the room with the yellow flowers in her hand. When at last she ventured to look up, she saw that her sister's head had drooped against the pillow, and that she was sleeping quietly. Her relaxed hand still held the jonquils, but it was evident that they had awakened no memories. She had dozed off almost as soon as Johnny had given them to her. The discovery gave Eliza a startled sense of the ruins that must be piled upon her past. "I don't believe I could have forgotten that day, though," she said to herself, but she was glad that Evelina had forgotten. Evelina's disease moved along the usual course, now lifting her on a brief wave of elation, now sinking her to new depths of weakness. There was little to be done, and the doctor came only at lengthening intervals. On his way out he always repeated his first friendly suggestion about sending Evelina to the hospital, and Eliza always answered, "I guess we can manage." The hours passed for her with the fierce rapidity that great joy or anguish lends them. She went through the days with a sternly smiling precision, but she hardly knew what was happening, and when nightfall released her from the shop and she could carry her work to Evelina's bedside, the same sense of unreality accompanied her, and she still seemed to be accomplishing a task whose object had escaped her memory. Once, when Evelina felt better, she expressed a desire to make some artificial flowers, and Eliza, deluded by this awakening interest, got out the faded bundles of stems and petals and the little tools and spools of wire. But after a few minutes the work dropped from Evelina's hands, and she said, "I'll wait until tomorrow." She never again spoke of the flower making, but one day, after watching Eliza's laboured attempt to trim a spring hat for Mrs. Hawkins, she demanded impatiently that the hat should be brought to her, and in a trice had galvanized the lifeless bow and given the brim the twist it needed. These were rare gleams, and more frequent were the days of speechless lassitude, when she lay for hours silently staring at the window, shaken only by the hard incessant cough that sounded to Eliza like the hammering of nails into a coffin. At length one morning Eliza, starting up from the mattress at the foot of the bed, hastily called Miss Mellins down, and ran through the smoky dawn for the doctor. He came back with her and did what he could to give Evelina momentary relief. Then he went away, promising to look in again before night. Miss Mellins, her head still covered with curl papers, disappeared in his wake, and when the sisters were alone, Evelina beckoned to Eliza. "You promised," she whispered, grasping her sister's arm, and Eliza understood. She had not dared to tell Miss Mellins of Evelina's change of faith. It had seemed even more difficult than borrowing the money, but now it had to be done. She ran upstairs after the dressmaker and detained her on the landing. "Miss Mellins, "Can you tell me where to send for a priest, a Roman Catholic priest?" "A priest, Miss Bunner?" "Yes, my sister became a Roman Catholic while she was away. They were kind to her in her sickness, and now she wants a priest." Ann Eliza faced Miss Mellins with unflinching eyes. "My Aunt Dugan'll know. I'll run right around to her the minute I get my papers off," the dressmaker promised, and Ann Eliza thanked her. An hour or two later the priest appeared. Ann Eliza, who was watching, saw him coming down the steps to the shop door and went to meet him. His expression was kind, but she shrank from his peculiar dress, and from his pale face with its bluish chin and enigmatic smile. Ann Eliza remained in the shop. Miss Mellins's girl had mixed the buttons again, and she set herself to sort them. The priest stayed a long time with Evelina. When he again carried his enigmatic smile past the counter, and Ann Eliza rejoined her sister, Evelina was smiling with something of the same mystery, but she did not tell her secret. After that it seemed to Ann Eliza that the shop and the back room no longer belonged to her. It was as though she were there on sufferance, indulgently tolerated by the unseen power which hovered over Evelina, even in the absence of its minister. The priest came almost daily, and at last a day arrived when he was called to administer some rite of which Ann Eliza but dimly grasped the sacramental meaning. All she knew was that it meant that Evelina was going, and going under this alien guidance even further from her than to the dark places of death. When the priest came, with something covered in his hands, she crept into the shop, closing the door of the back room to leave him alone with Evelina. It was a warm afternoon in May, and the crooked ailanthus tree rooted in a fissure of the opposite pavement was a fountain of tender green. Women in light dresses passed with the languid step of spring, and presently there came a man with a hand-cart full of pansy and geranium plants, who stopped outside the window, signalling to Ann Eliza to buy. An hour went by before the door of the back room opened, and the priest reappeared with that mysterious covered something in his hands. Ann Eliza had risen, drawing back as he passed. He had doubtless divined her antipathy, for he had hitherto only bowed in going in and out, but to-day he paused and looked at her compassionately. "I have left your sister in a very beautiful state of mind," he said in a low voice like a woman's. "She is full of spiritual consolation." Ann Eliza was silent, and he bowed and went out. She hastened back to Evelina's bed, and knelt down beside it. Evelina's eyes were very large and bright. She turned them on Ann Eliza with a look of inner illumination. "I shall see the baby," she said. Then her eyelids fell, and she dozed. The doctor came again at nightfall, administering some last palliatives, and after he had gone, Ann Eliza, refusing to have her vigil shared by Miss Mellins or Mrs. Hawkins, sat down to keep watch alone. It was a very quiet night. Evelina never spoke or opened her eyes, but in the still hour before dawn Ann Eliza saw that the restless hand outside the bedclothes had stopped its twitching. She stooped over and felt no breath on her sister's lips. The funeral took place 3 days later. Evelina was buried in Calvary Cemetery, the priest assuming the whole care of the necessary arrangements, while Ann Eliza, a passive spectator, beheld with stony indifference this last negation of her past. A week afterward she stood in her bonnet and mantle in the doorway of the little shop. Its whole aspect had changed. Counter and shelves were bare. The window was stripped of its familiar miscellany of artificial flowers, note-paper, wire hat frames, and limp garments from the dyers, and against the glass pane of the doorway hung a sign, "This store to let." Ann Eliza turned her eyes from the sign as she went out and locked the door behind her. Evelina's funeral had been very expensive, and Ann Eliza, having sold her stock in trade and the few articles of furniture that remained to her, was leaving the shop for the last time. She had not been able to buy any mourning, but Miss Mellins had sewed some crape on her old black mantle and bonnet, and having no gloves, she slipped her bare hands under the folds of the mantle. It was a beautiful morning, and the air was full of a warm sunshine that had coaxed open nearly every window in the street, and summoned to the window-sills the sickly plants nurtured indoors in winter. Ann Eliza's way lay westward, toward Broadway, but at the corner she paused and looked back down the familiar length of the street. Her eyes rested a moment on the blotched Bunner sisters above the empty window of the shop. Then they travelled on to the overflowing foliage of the square, above which was the church tower with the dial that had marked the hours for the sisters before Ann Eliza had bought the nickel clock. She looked at it all as though it had been the scene of some unknown life, of which the vague report had reached her. She felt for herself the only remote pity that busy people accord to the misfortunes which come to them by hearsay. She walked to Broadway and down to the office of the house agent to whom she had entrusted the subletting of the shop. She left the key with one of his clerks, who took it from her as if it had been any one of 1,000 others, and remarked that the weather looked as if spring was really coming. Then she turned and began to move up the great thoroughfare, which was just beginning to wake to its multitudinous activities. She walked less rapidly now, studying each shop window as she passed, but not with the desultory eye of enjoyment. The watchful fixity of her gaze overlooked everything but the object of its quest. At length she stopped before a small window wedged between two mammoth buildings, and displaying, behind its shining plate glass festooned with muslin, a varied assortment of sofa cushions, tea-cloths, pen-wipers, painted calendars, and other specimens of feminine industry. In a corner of the window she had read, on a slip of paper pasted against the pane, "Wanted, a saleslady," and after studying the display of fancy articles beneath it, she gave her mantle a twitch, straightened her shoulders, and went in. Behind a counter crowded with pin-cushions, watch-holders, and other needlework trifles, a plump young woman with smooth hair sat sewing bows of ribbon on a scrap basket. The little shop was about the size of the one on which Evelina had just closed the door, and it looked as fresh and gay and thriving as she and Evelina had once dreamed of making Bunner sisters. The friendly air of the place made her pluck up courage to speak. "Saleslady? Yes, we do want one. Have you anyone to recommend?" the young woman asked, not unkindly. Ann Eliza hesitated, disconcerted by the unexpected question, and the other, cocking her head on one side to study the effect of the bow she had just sewed on the basket, continued, "We can't afford more than $30 a month, but the work is light. She would be expected to do a little fancy sewing between times. We want a bright girl, stylish and pleasant manners. You know what I mean. Not over 30, anyhow, and nice-looking. Will you write down the name?" Ann Eliza looked at her confusedly. She opened her lips to explain, and then, without speaking, turned toward the crisply curtained door. "Ain't you going to leave the address?" the young woman called out after her. Ann Eliza went out into the thronged street. The great city, under the fair spring sky, seemed to throb with the stir of innumerable beginnings. She walked on, looking for another shop window with a sign in it. End of chapter 13. End of Bunner Sisters by Edith Wharton.